Hello, how we doing out there? My name is Tim Heuisler, American Whiskey Ambassador for Beam Suntory. Coming to you pre-recorded live from our Beam Suntory headquarters here in New York City. Before joining Beam Suntory, spent my whole life in hospitality. Ran a whiskey bar in Philadelphia called Time. It was a whiskey bar and jazz venue for about 10 years. That's where I learned to really appreciate whiskey. Went from just being like a tool in my tool belt as a bartender to a passion, to a hobby, and now eventually into a career, which is super exciting. But we get a lot of, kind of questions about the 101s of American whiskey versus bourbon. So just to clear up some of those today, biggest question I always get is, does all bourbon have to be made in Kentucky? It does not. So if we follow the guidelines or the rules of bourbon making, this goes back to 1964 to President Lyndon B. Johnson. He actually put this into law to protect bourbon as our native spirit. So rule number one of bourbon, it's got to be made in the United States. We do make 95% of it in Kentucky, but legally you can make it anywhere in the United States. Rule number two, the grain that we're going to cook, ferment, and distill to turn into our whiskey, it's got to be at least 51% corn. So the majority of our mash bill is going to be corn. It's then backed up by either rye and malted barley, or sometimes wheat and malted barley, sometimes brown rice and malted barley, but corn's got to be the predominant grain. Last but not least, you got to be put into a brand new charred white oak container. You can only use that once, one-time use. We do not reuse our barrels. When we're done with them, we can send them off to Ireland or Scotland or Japan or down to Mexico to make tequila or bourbon barrel-aged beer, go age rum in it. So huge markets for first-time use barrels. But we'll use them once, then we'll sell them off. Coming off the still, no hotter than 160 proof. Entering the barrel for maturation, our spirit can be no hotter than 125 proof. And then last but not least, when it enters that bottle to take home or the liquor stores or at the bar, no lower than 80 proof or 40% alcohol inside that bottle. You follow those guidelines, you got bourbon whiskey. And then the next question we get pretty often, especially for the Jim Beam House, is what is small batch? We have a handful of small batch whiskeys. We got Knob Creek, Basil Hayden's, Baker's, and in my mind, most importantly, is Booker's Bourbon. Now, Booker Noe was our sixth generation master distiller, and he's actually one that created the term small batch whiskey. Legally, there is no numerical definition to small batch. It means it's not a single barrel, and it means it's not all of our barrels, right? It's a small batch. So when we look at our particular small batches, something like Booker's, we're talking about 200 to 250 barrels of whiskey that we mature in very specific warehouses, in very specific parts of those warehouses to create Booker's Bourbon. When you look at some of our large batch or large scale production whiskeys, something like our Jim Beam White Label, you might be looking at closer to 1,200 barrels a batch. And those barrels are spread out amongst many different warehouses in many different parts of the warehouses. So small batch is just referring to a smaller batch of production. You can make a small batch at a very large distillery like Jim Beam, or maybe some smaller distilleries. But without Booker Noe, in the late 80s, early 90s, we wouldn't have small batch whiskey. And if you haven't had Booker's before, cast strength, uncut, non-chill filtered, just a fair warning, maybe not your entry-level bourbon, but certainly one of my favorites. Hope that cleared up the misconceptions of bourbon whiskey, and hope you can tune into another one. Take care.